Bonsoir à vous tous et bienvenue à la
Good evening to you all and welcome for this week of the Anthropocene Festival. Tonight, we will talk about vulnerability. Are we all vulnerable? And so we are really privileged to welcome tonight Joy Sorman and Frédéric Keck and Eric Kleinenberg from New York. There you are, Eric. Good evening. Or good afternoon, rather. The subject for tonight.
Yeah, we're happy also. Donc certaines des actions humaines ont induit des
The
réactions
subject
système
for
parfois irrémédiables sur
tonight
phénomènes
is
que
the
l'Anthropocène
vulnerability.
illustre et que nous vivons de plein fouet. Mais toutes ces existences sont-elles vulnérables de la
Are
même
our
manière?
lives all vulnerable in the same way? And how can we define this concept of vulnerability? How to change paradigm? Or how can we avoid the risks? For whom and for what? For this cross-discussion between these visions, we're welcoming tonight Joy Sorman, who published several books as Boys, Boys, Boys or À la folie that we had the privilege to read. Frédéric Keck, you're a philosopher and an anthropologist. You're part of the social anthropology laboratory. You've published several books, published in 2020, The Sentinels of the Pandemic, Virus Hunters at the Borders of China. And Eric Kleinenberg, you're a sociologist, social scientist, and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. You're the author of several books, Palaces for the People.
Infrastructure can help fight inequality, polarization, and the decline of civic life. Et Heatwave, a social
and also Heatwave
disaster in Chicago, and so on. So, I would. Pardon, excusez-moi, j'allais continuer en
Sorry, I need to speak French.
Je vous propose à chacun tout d'abord de commencer par une.
So before we start, could you please introduce yourself a little bit or give us a short introduction by giving a definition of what vulnerability is to you. So we'll start with Joy. If you can read some pages of your book.
Good evening, thank you for inviting me to the debate. Maybe I will introduce the book. The book is called À la folie, and I wrote it after spending 1 year in a mental hospital. 1 year that I spent there 1 day a week, not as a patient, of course, but my point was to be among people with the patients and the nurses, and to work on the long term there, to get acquainted with the way they work, the way they live, and how the inhabitants of this micro society, where vulnerability has a strong meaning, craziness, and people being closed up. So in my book, people meet each other, and this is an extract I'll read that tells about the meeting of a man, a psychotic man called Frank, if I'm not wrong. Thank you. This helps us understand the context of what you are about to read. Frank is 40 years old. He's well known in Pavilion 4B. He has been staying there regularly for more than 20 years, from his mother's flat to the crisis center, from the day hospital to the nursing home, and then back to square one on closed wall. He told me I'll be back in 5 minutes. Reappeared after putting a fleece over his crepe paper pyjamas and a pair of swimming pool flip-flops, offered to sit down in the TV room and told me in an equanimous tone a life of pain and violence. As a child, I was dyslexic and my father would beat me up. As he was a dermatologist, he knew exactly what to hit so that it would leave as few traces as possible. He would beat me up for any reason because I had used too much toilet paper. My mother drank 2 scoops of portée a day. It may sound a lot, but in her village, it was the norm, the usual dose. Everyone drank it. The last time my father hit me, I was 13 years old, and it was on July the 14th. Blood spurted. I rebelled. I became big and strong. I had the upper hand. The psychiatrist explained to me that hitting was exciting. Maybe I was sexually excited by my dad, but I never denounced it. I always kept it to myself. I didn't want to be sent to a Department of Health and Security center. Besides, I don't blame him. I just sometimes have a bit of resentment. He comes to see me at the hospital. He brings me cigarettes. I love my parents. That's how it is. There's nothing we can do about it. It's only my link, so I keep. So after that bad period, I took a professional qualification course in landscape gardening. I was very good at putting ewes. I worked for a while in the green areas department, and I got tired of it. So I said to myself, why not joining the mountain in friendship? But the week before the test, I didn't sleep. I smoked pot while watching TV. I lost it, and all that ended at the mental hospital. I was 19. It was my first day. I stayed there for 2 years. When I went out, I met a girl. I wasn't working. I was a social anyway, so I moved in with her. We were fine. I cooked pasta alla carbonara for her, frog's legs and roast beef, and we even went to Cannes on holiday. My girlfriend was nymphomaniac, but I didn't care. It went on like that for several years, and one day, once again, I smoked too much pot. My eyes went to the back of my head. They stuck to the back of my skull, and they looked at me. They watched me. It was unbearable. I had too much delirium in me, and also the corpse of a twin that I had swallowed in my mother's womb because I was the stronger of the two, the more determined. Too much delirium in me, and parts of me scattered. My stomach disappeared. My belly became hollow, full of holes. It's better now. Touch it. Look how well rounded it is. Too much delirium in me, and ectoplasm that spied on me, followed me everywhere in silence, slided on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. So much delirium in me that they said that I had attacked a patient on my arrival because he was walking with my legs. That bastard had stolen my legs from me. Pause. Frank takes a long breath, moves his chair closer, checks at a glance that nobody's spying on us, leans over to my ear. You know, at one point, I was so pure that I laid down on the grass and lots of daisies started to grow around me. Frank, with his shining eyes, it looks like he's going to cry. I must say that he saw beauty very closely. Frank is in care without consent by decision of a state representative. For violence, he stabbed his mother's dog. Yet Frank tells us that he's the one who has already died 10 times, that he was killed in the street by passers-by, then resurrected. In reality, he doesn't say, I resurrect. He says, I live again, and that makes a big difference. It means that life is lurking in him, that it doesn't fall from the sky, and that's not a miracle, but a resource. Frank tells me about the werewolf huddled in his intestines, assures me that if he stops taking his medication, he'll become the beast again, and that the conversion is immediate. But the curse is not so much to be a werewolf as to put on this terrifying appearance while one's heart is full of goodness. When I smoke pot, I scare people in spite of myself. I'm a delicate monster, though, but whatever I do, the feature of my face scare people. Franz, the tender prodigy, is sorry to frighten the passengers in the bus, whereas his transformation is only intended to absorb the negative waves that pollute the surroundings. But how to be understood when the facial expression does not match the truth of the intentions?
Thank you so much for sharing this excerpt from your book, and I'd like you to express yourself about Frank and the space he evolves in, and will discover his vulnerability and his constant vulnerability. And I'd like to give you the floor, Frederick Keck, with the article that you published in the review 2021. So this is a text that I wrote in order to summarize the result of my studies related to vulnerability. And this is not a central topic in my work, but more on what animals can transmit to humans in terms of diseases. So it's called Shared Vulnerability and Immunity Between Humans and Animals, Policy Lessons from Xeronosis. The COVID-19 pandemic comes at the end of half a century in which biologists alerted health authorities to the threat of infection diseases transmissible from animals to humans, or zoonosis. The emergence of Ebola in 1976, HIV/AIDS in 1981, bovine spongiform encephalopathy in 1994, the H5N1 avian influenza virus in 1997, and SARS in 2001 confirmed that the era of infectious diseases is not over, contrary to the declarations of the WHO after the eradication of smallpox in the 1970s. The transformations of mankind is imposing on the planet what geologists call the entry into the Anthropocene era are impacting the behavior of animals and favoring mutations in the microbes carried by these animals, increasing the chances of transmission to humans. These zoonotic diseases have given rise to new forms of identification with animals. The term cannibal cows, or terrace chickens has been used to refer to these domestic animals that have suddenly become wild again, though contact with the reservoir of mutations, whereas it was factory farming that favored the transmission of a pathogen that mutated in a random manner. The term nature's revenge has been used as if bats and primates were responding to the destruction of their habitat by sending pathogens, whereas it is places of accumulation such as bushmeat or traditional medicine markets that are bottlenecks for virus mutations in animal reservoirs. Anonymous vocabulary has been used to describe those animal populations that are beyond the control of naturalists, those humans who extract themselves from the rest of nature in order to classify and control it. It's possible to understand such seemingly animist statements while remaining as close as possible to scientific data. In what sense can we say that zoonotic pathogens are signals sent by animals to humans to alert them to the threats of their current way of living together? Saying that there is communication between humans and animals through microbes does not lead to attributing to them a consciousness and subjectivity such as we receive through symbolic language. Rather, it makes it possible to study an exchange of signs in a community exposed to common threats, which responds to the deficiencies of the exchange of goods in this community. In other words, it is to pose a solidarity between humans and animals that does not pass through an explicit contract, but through an implicit contract stemming from domestication and recently transformed to the point of having become untenable. In order to apply this idea of solidarity to human-animal relations, I will analyze the notions of vulnerability and immunity. Zoonotic crises have revealed that animals are as vulnerable as humans to pathogens produced by the intensification of livestock farming. The prine, a pathogen that had been circulating at low noise levels in European livestock farming since its discovery in sheep in the 19th century in the form of scrapi, was multiplied by the decrease in the warming temperature of animal meal in feed factories in England, leading to brain degeneration in both cattle and humans. Images of sponge brain, cattle brains, similar to those of patients with new Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, allow the symptoms of the disease to be interpreted as loss of balance in cows that eventually collapse in the meadows. Similarly, farmed poultry are exposed to a range of diseases such as Newcastle disease, whose control through vaccination has allowed the intensification of factory farming, but influenza, by spreading rapidly from wild birds to industrial poultry, with the potential for a pandemic if it passes to humans, has revealed a recent transformation of this farm. Poultry die of influenza through digestive and not through respiratory disorders like humans, and this difference in symptoms makes them sentinels of pandemics. Poultry droppings on farms or markets can be seen as signs of a virus that can circulate invisibly through aerosols transmitted around the world. Attention to the symptoms of diseases through their differences and similarities between human and animals leads us to go beyond the language of risk, which reports cases of transmission in statistical tables to reflect on the experience of vulnerability, the exposure of humans and animals to common threats due to the intensification of factory farming leads to threshold crossing, of which disease is an expression. Animals then act as sentinels, enabling humans to prepare for these catastrophic thresholds. Vulnerability, before being a risk factor in a calculation, must be considered as a form of susceptibility and exposure of oneself to the other. The whole problem is then to understand why the other, the microbe, makes the host that has to host it sick. This is where the notion of immunity must come into play. The immune system has been conceived as the set of defenses that allow the organism to recognize the self and the non-self. However, recent research shows that it's rather a complex chain of signaling that allows the absorption of a microbial information within the biota already present in the organism. One explanation for the highly pathogenic nature of zoonotic microbes is that they are not recognized by the immune system because they've crossed species boundaries. Some viruses, such as the SARS coronavirus, may even be able to lure dendritic cells known as sentinel cells. Sentinel cells are located on the front line of the immune system and must capture information from new microbes and transmit it to other immune cells. While these cells can absorb a lot of different information, other immune cells mobilize antibodies formed for previous infections. By failing to present the antibodies for a new virus, these second-line cells trigger an inflammation known as cytokine storm, which can cause the body to die. While animals cause catastrophic immune responses in humans because their antigenic information is not recognized, they can also play a positive role in building immunity. Let's remind ourselves that vaccination comes from the use of a strain of smallpox that developed in cattle, the vaccinia, and whose attenuated nature allows the human immune system to develop antibodies. Influenza vaccines are manufactured on chicken embryos, where the hemagglutination reaction that gave the influenza viruses their scientific name was studied through the different types of H. Finally, the presence of many emerging viruses in bats is explained by the fact that their immune system has enabled them to resist both flight and colony life, leading biologists to study their interference in the hope of finding the key to strengthening the human immune system. The notions of vulnerability and immunity, taken in their ordinary meanings, may thus seem to point in the direction of solidarity between humans against diseases coming from animals. However, this ordinary meaning is often dependent on a conception of health linked to the calculation of risks and the construction of safety barriers. If we follow the research of veterinarians and microbiologists on zoonosis, we can develop another understanding of these notions which allows for the integration of animals into the human community through the common exposure to microbes produced by catastrophic transformations of the environment and the production of warning signals, which allow for the absorption of these shocks in the microbiota. We can then speak of a sharing of vulnerabilities and immunities in the sense that beyond the symbolic and apparently contradictory identifications of humans to animals in the crisis situation, zoonotic pathogens reveal the same belonging to the living world on common resources for processing information through warning signals. This would be the political lesson of zoonosis. And I apologize to our interpreters who have had to read this.
So I'll take advantage of the moon to give you the floor. Eric Kleinenberg, maybe we can hear your definition of vulnerability. How can you approach this complex concept?
Yes, well, first, let me say thank you for inviting me into this conversation, and it's really an honor to be here with you and to hear such a deep insight into the topic from different perspectives. I have been thinking about the question of vulnerability for some time, and I guess it's our concern about vulnerability that keeps me in my room here in New York, not in Lyon right now, which is where I would much rather be. But the truth is, how do I define my vulnerability at the moment? It's a state of exposure in which it does not take too much of an external hazard or threat to cause distress or damage to me that could be significant. And kind of vulnerability generally operates in that pattern. It's a state of exposure in which one's defenses are weakened, and the one could be an individual, it could be a collective, and it renders the object susceptible to damage from forces that in other circumstances might do little harm at all. I think about vulnerability in the context of the Anthropocene, which has been our theme for the last few days. When I go back to this very famous image called Blue Marble, which is the first image of the Earth taken in color from the Apollo 17 spacecraft in 1972. It's a well-known image, especially in the United States, because I think for years the U.S. took a lot of pride in NASA and its ability to get spaceships into orbit and human beings on the moon. But in the context of this extraordinary feat of science, this display of power and capacity, the blue marble image is also a kind of striking reminder of our collective vulnerability, because one way of interpreting the image is that it shows the Earth as a very small object in a much larger space, an object that instead of seeming worldly, seems so minuscule that it could easily be disrupted or obliterated altogether. And of course, with the fate of the Earth, this one Earth, goes all of us. And, the vulnerability is obviously a charged topic for a sociological investigation or sociological research. And I am a sociologist. Sociologists tend to be interested in problems organized around inequality. And it's just plainly the case that we are not all equally protected, that some people are safer and wealthier and better off and healthier than others. And that means in the context of climate change, in the context of a global pandemic, in the context of ordinary problems like mental health, for instance, some people and some places will be far more vulnerable than others. And so the challenging feature of climate change and a challenging element of life in the Anthropocene is that, on the one hand, it renders all of humanity vulnerable to a common threat, right, which is the transformation of the Earth and of Earth systems. It's the rising waters, the higher heat, the bursts of extreme weather, the expression of pandemic diseases, that will circulate more readily as conditions on Earth change. So, for instance, as human beings come to settle into areas where we did not settle before and get closer to the animal species that Professor Keck was just discussing, our interactions will get thicker and our exposure to infectious disease will grow. As the permafrost melts, we will be exposed to other new bacteria that have been frozen for ages. And there's every reason to believe that with climate change will come a whole new set of threats that will afflict all of humanity. There's a way in which we will all be in it together. And so that is the other feature of the blue marble, this image. It's not just the Earth as a small floating ball in the sky, in the atmosphere, in space. It's also an image of all of us together in one place. With all of these other things around us. It's an image that allows us the imagination, or encourages the imagination of something like a global community, which can sound like a cliche at other times, a bromide. There is no such thing as the global community, but when we see the image of the blue marble, there's a part of us that wants to imagine one, and to think about the Earth and everyone on it and every living thing on it in opposition to those that are not. It's a distinction that allows us to identify ourselves. And so there is a way in which, when we're all on this blue marble on the Earth, we are all in it together. It's unquestionable that all of the living species that are here are on Earth together, are in it together, that as we enter into this new geological era of the Anthropocene, as we enter into this new historical moment, we share vulnerability in ways that are recognizable. But it would be naive for a sociologist to say that and stop there, because as every one of us listening today knows, we are very clearly unequally exposed. And some people, some places on Earth are far more vulnerable to a rising sea, or to a heat wave, or to a burst of flood, or to death by pandemic disease than others, right? And so and those forms of inequality, they don't map on perfectly to other inequalities. It's not just a question of class position. It's more interesting than that, of course. This is one of the kind of great ideas of Ulrich Beck's risk society thesis, there are categories of risk that map onto class position that are not the same as class position. So there's more to it than that. But class inequality and wealth inequality is likely to be a more significant factor, making some people vulnerable and keeping other people protected than anything else. And that's a point that is, scientifically maybe not especially interesting because it's something we know very well, but politically that's something that we need to be reminded of because it should inform the way we approach problems like when there's a pandemic, which people and which places should get vaccines first? How would you distribute those vaccines to make sure that you're attending to the inequalities around vulnerability? And yet we fail to do that. And certainly when it comes to life with climate change, there are all kinds of inequalities that we might want to address in the name of climate equity, but that which we will not address. And so I think one of the fears that I have and that many people share is that as we move more squarely into this new geological era of the Anthropocene, as climate change takes hold, the problem of environmental injustice based on differential levels of vulnerability that are totally predictable and organized around the history of colonialism, the history of racial discrimination, and the history of the hoarding of wealth, that all of those things will come to matter in new ways. And this, I think, is a problem for scientists who are interested in understanding our situation more clearly. It's also becoming an ever more urgent problem for people in the world of policy and praxis who would like to do something to make the world a better place. I'm going to stop there so we can have some discussion.
Merci, Eric Kleinenberg pour cette perspective.
Thanks a lot, Eric Kleinenberg, for sharing your view on vulnerability and Anthropocene, because the past, the present, and the future are marked by this new era, and where we are all vulnerable, whether we're human or not. No need to go back to that. But this vulnerability forces us to adapt on a daily basis, on a constantly changing environment. For instance, we live with this ambiguity every day. And the three of you speak about vulnerability related with our surrounding environment. Sometimes this environment is polarized, insulated, or open to social relationships. We can see a place for interaction. So beyond this ambiguity supported by the identified spaces in your work, what are the characteristics that you could show as elements questioning vulnerability in a positive way that is reducing vulnerability, or negatively spaces that would be themselves vulnerable and that would induce more vulnerabilities? So maybe Joyce Salmon, with your work at the mental hospital and the relationship with cities and villages or therapeutical flats, how can you analyze this gap between insulation and social interaction areas?
Well, it's true that the spaces of psychiatry are really diverse, and they're really open spaces towards society. And the last space for this is the isolation chamber. And it doesn't show the level of suffering, but the level of dangerousness that we project on the person that we isolate. And this person will be granted the right to still be part of society or to be isolated from society. That's what's inherent to psychiatry because the person is locked down and locked up to protect society from this person. And to get back to the question of vulnerability, we suppose that the deranged person or the crazy person is, the insane person is dangerous to society and to other people, and so that these people cannot be integrated into society. But we reach a certain point for society to integrate insanity. So this poses the question of the vulnerability of our society. And it's true that this psychiatric space is a closed space, and we start by closing down these spaces, and of course there are day units and night units. And of course the ultimate space is the isolation chamber, as I was saying. And of course the objective is to rehabilitate the person into society. That's the ultimate objective. But of course this raises questions, because we could wonder whether these persons, these people want to be reintegrated into society and rehabilitated. So there's a kind of opposition and dialectic space between the indoor space and the outdoor space. So these people are rejected sometimes. And so now I'm going to change the order, says the moderator, in a very authoritative way. I know that you're really attached to local conditions, Eric, and especially during disasters, and especially for these palaces, for the people, like social infrastructures, so schools, swimming pools, stadiums, etc. So how can these spaces be prepared to crises, and how can they question vulnerability?
Well, Professor Keck will be very interesting on this theme as well, I think.
Je vais bien sûr lui poser la question.
I'll ask him the question.
It depends very much on the kind of threat. And so, for instance, this book I wrote called Palaces for the People is about social infrastructure. And one of the arguments it makes is that there's a certain set of threats for which social proximity and physical proximity allows people to produce the kind of solidarity that Professor Keck was discussing. That a solidarity that's organized around some form of support and care and attention, that's galvanized by people's capacity to recognize the humanity of others and the way in which they deserve support. That's something enabled by proximity and recurrent interaction. And so, I think in many cases, physical proximity and gathering places, like a playground or a library or a school, are essential for addressing vulnerability. So, if I think, for instance, about the problem of climate change and the rise of the Anthropocene, engaging that problem requires some notion that there is a kind of a common good that is worth advancing, and that we're better off if we are collectively addressing a problem than we are if we address that problem as individuals in a private market, acting on our own for our own self-interests. After all, none of us as individuals has the capacity to deal with climate change. And it's my view that, I've done a lot of research and writing to make the point that we are dealing with a kind of crisis of the social contract at the moment. The social compact in one democracy after the next is falling apart, and it's quite difficult to mobilize a campaign to deal with a threat like climate change if we don't have some sense of a shared identity and a sense of linked fate. And I argue in my work that this is something that's best produced when we have gathering places that are physical and not just screens where we encounter each other like as if we're bubbles. And I think that is, I stand by that view. And yet, as we've seen in the COVID pandemic, there are some situations in which physical proximity and social closeness can be a formula for disaster. So obviously, the way that you stay safe in a pandemic where infectious disease is the problem is you need to be physically distant. And so I still believe that our physical spaces and proximity before the crisis can matter. So it's my view that the way to deal with a pandemic like the one we're in right now is to have physical distance and social solidarity, right? Physical distance and social solidarity, which is very different from what the World Health Organization advises. The World Health Organization says we need social distance. And I think this is a horrible mistake. I think this is a very dangerous category, social distancing, because really we need physical separation and social proximity, social closeness. And the way that physical space affects that is something for us to discuss.
Est-ce que peut-être je peux vous permettre de rebondir sur ce point justement?
Can I just build upon this? The difference between social distancing and physical distancing. Well, vulnerability, if it's then related to global health and world health, comprises a set of risks in public health, in the awareness-raising techniques for public health, that correspond to the difference of social classes and income. And as Professor Kleinenberg was saying, vulnerability comprises these differences and also includes other types. And when it comes to the pandemic, we also consider the density, the density in population in places and the interactions between humans and non-human beings. And of course, to distinguish this from other vulnerable populations and comorbidity factors, or these public places, airports, marketplaces, farms, in which there's a high concentration of animals, they do not meet the requirements of the public health recommendations that we received, because this pandemic is totally unforeseeable. So how can we prepare or get prepared for this? I think there's a kind of shift in the way vulnerability and our sensitiveness to and sensitivity to vulnerability is perceived, and a lot of whistleblowers are criticizing the fact that we are exaggerating the way we respond to this pandemic, and we can understand this as being oversensitive. But sentinels, as I was saying earlier, these territories and populations that are specifically and highly sensitive to the fact that we are getting over the thresholds, and social distancing for the places where threats emerge is something that leads us to receiving signals that will help us get prepared and imagine them, and also relate them to urgent threats of different kinds, like terrorist attacks, or clusters. And we can use the word outbreaks for these in English. And in terms of climate, it's the same. And we don't know how to react, and we don't know how to prepare ourselves for other threats. And in the case of these sentinel populations, this will allow us to get prepared for climate change on the long haul. Of course, the Anthropocene, as you mentioned and defined with all these ranking levels, show this multifaceted world with all the interconnections between beings. So, what about the social framework? And we've seen that there have been social upheaval where the vulnerables changed their situations and changed perspectives. So the shift from normality to insanity, where the insane person will help the whole Chinese society to change. And for the famous person that everyone hates. And so what is interesting to me in this notion of vulnerability is the approach that we have in the vision of these people. So how can the vulnerability of these people become the issue of other people? How can vulnerability reverse itself? So who would like to answer that question first before getting to the Q&A session? And I'm losing my notes, sorry. Well, I'd like to build up on this and on sentinels is that the question of vulnerability is very often confused with passivity and powerlessness, because very often we perceive threats that others cannot perceive because they're not in their routine activities. And so this shift in passivity, which is the driving factor of social transformations with scandals and controversies, and the fact of integrating the most vulnerable people inside the community forces us and forces the community to question itself. The most vulnerable show and criticize the patterns or the organizational patterns that we have. And from on the other end, the people who consider they're not insane are totally insane. That's to say that when someone becomes or gets into a mental hospital where they think that they are not considered as mentally ill or insane before the doctor says so, or exactly, well, the insane person who is supposed to be the vulnerable person shows society its own incapacity and anguish and miss. The insane person shows that society thinks it's strong and shows that it's built on lies. Bringing meaning to our lives. And for the insane person, they know that we're going to die one day or another, and eventually. And so this tragic and comical life is something that is exposed by the insane person to invent roles And to get back to what I was saying, and on the shift, this goes through language, and that's why for mentally insane people, there's this delirium of insanity, the reconstruction of reality. And on the other end, there is the scientific message that classifies in a very authoritative way, saying you're a bipolar person, you're a schizophrenic person. And so the insane person is full of his or her delirium, and they feel powerful, and that's what Frank tells in my story. And then the doctor will be the person who extracts him from his delirium, so you're no longer Frank, you are the insane person that I've labeled. And he becomes a patient, and in the word patient, there's the word patience, and also the fact that he becomes passive. And this is a very vertical, top-to-bottom approach. So this shift here is the fact that the doctor determines things and has some kind of power on the insane person. And Eric, can I ask you a question? The fact of talking about vulnerability, doesn't it show that human beings are vulnerable? All of a sudden, we realize that we are vulnerable people. So that's the question we got. What do you think?
Well, yes. I mean, we know, for instance, that in human relationships, vulnerability is, on the one hand, a signal or a sign of a kind of weakness or exposure, but it's also the moment at which growth and closeness become possible again. You know, without a recognition of vulnerability as of an individual in relation to others, there's no motivation to do something different, to get closer to truth. So, you know, on this theme again, it's a mistake to believe that vulnerability means weakness only. That vulnerability is only something to be avoided. In fact, I mean, one could say about the moment we're in now, that if there's any possibility in it, it's that when we live through something like a pandemic and see the damage that it does to us as individuals and societies, and to see what it does to our kind of social and technical systems and modes of governance, that it is a kind of wake-up call for us to do things differently. What a mistake it would be for us to live through this moment, this crisis, and say what we need to do once every arm has been given a jab of vaccine is to build things back exactly like they were before. And it will be our recognition of vulnerability that motivates some kind of transformation coming out of this. And if we fail that, we will experience this kind of thing again. And that is, I think, obviously true in the case of the Anthropocene, in the case of climate change, that if we can't recognize expressions of damage for what they are and see our vulnerability in them, it is a pretty hopeless situation. Unfortunately, I think we have a very long record at this point of responding to events like this with something like denial, and sometimes organized denial, and refusal to take the lesson seriously. And I should note that if at the beginning of our conversation I started to talk about this one planet and the blue marble and the notion that we all share a world, I think one of the defining features of this moment we're in now is it's become increasingly clear that on many issues, we are in fact living in different worlds. We are experiencing this as if we live in different worlds. And so one real challenge is to figure out how to integrate some notion of shared experience and shared lesson and shared vulnerability if some people insist that they're functionally operating on another planet.
Alors du coup, comment aborder ces différents degrés de vulnérabilité?
So how can we tackle these different levels of vulnerability connecting humans and not humans? I think the issue of degree marks the difference between fragility and vulnerability. That there was a question about that. Fragility shows the human being as an object made of china bones, a vase, exposed to danger, whereas vulnerability shows that to a certain level of shock, there might be a bad reaction, but it's always a gradual reaction, depending also from the level of information we get. I was listening to Eric Kleinenberg saying that vulnerability is also the condition for growth and the ability to integrate viruses within our DNA is what explains the constitution of placenta for mammals, because if there wouldn't have been a virus a long time ago in order to modify the protein that rejects grafts and the implantation of a fetus, we couldn't have children within the women's womb. So the virus conditions the acceptance of otherness and the evolution of mammals. So we are exposed to virus coming from different places. The consequence of globalization is complex, but in the evolution of humanity, this vulnerability of our DNA to that virus information was the context for growth. So we are not china bone objects, but beings capable of absorbing shocks. So this is a scale of values where we get different levels of vulnerability. So how can we imagine these different levels of vulnerability within a mental hospital? Can we feel these different levels, this danger? This is what I said at the beginning. The issue of fragility or vulnerability in the mental hospital is ambiguous, is not clear. Should we protect society or should we protect the ill people? What group is the most fragile? There is room for interpretation. All the patients I've met, and no nurse agrees on a diagnosis. So vulnerability is always challenged, also because of the fact that we have to wonder about the index. Is the vulnerability of a patient should be analyzed through suffering or through the level of delirium? What is the scale? How can we assess madness? Some psychiatrists say that the only criterion is suffering. So when Frank says that I've got hallucinations, I can see mermaids, but I'm not suffering, some doctors say, if this person is not suffering, he has nothing to do in a hospital. So, but other doctors say that that patient doesn't have access to his suffering. So in the name of this unconsciousness, this patient is vulnerable. So it's an always revolving question. So psychiatry is also an always evolving science. So we cannot set up for good unless we take an authoritarian position, a final decision. And also a patient can feel very sad one day and the day after very happy, because it's also related with the level of delirium, and it is a form of protection against suffering. So the issue of fragility or vulnerability is fantastic because it's never set in stone. And as you've said, one of the strengths of psychiatry is to be unclear in the prescriptions, the way we should treat a patient, how to help a patient. So prescribing is interesting. So let me react with a question from the audience. What are the consequences when we speak about vulnerability on the social level? Will it lead to more solidarity or the opposite? In other words, do you think that this concept of vulnerability will bring us together?
It seems Eric.
I think I see you looking at the screen.
Yes,
so
that's for you then, Eric. Sorry.
Okay.
That will be fine.
I think it's a fair question. Is the label vulnerability the kind of thing that gets us marching in the streets together to build solidarity, or does the label vulnerability make the group that's defined that way feel defensive and misunderstood and insulted because the concept has robbed them of their dignity? I think if you think about it, that's very similar to the debates in France about the concept of marginality from years ago, or the kind of underclass in the United States. And so, I don't know that it's that vulnerability as a concept in the streets is a great rallying cry for social mobilization, but I do think it's a fair analytic concept to be used by social scientists or scientists who want to understand patterns of inequality and different levels of exposure. And like I said, vulnerability is not a simple word. To go back to this last discussion, it is not fragility. And although in some places it might be interpreted to be stigmatizing, there's something about the concept that is, I think, intended to humanize and to show our capacity for growth and change. We are at the end of the day all mortal, and I think vulnerability points out that some of us, in some situations and some conditions, are more mortal than others.
Est-ce que l'un de vous veut continuer ou rebondir?
And here, Joy, Frederick, would you like to react? Is vulnerability solidarity or in opposition? Solidarity, as it structured in the 19th century, was the idea of sharing the debt from one generation to another. So no generation should feel self-sufficient, because every generation receives something from the generation before, and it's also an exposure to threats. So solidarity between generations allow each generation to be protected against threats. Is the reason for which we have social security. All the threats, you live in a society transmitting diseases and industrial accidents, but maybe we've reached a new level of solidarity, because it's not only a solidarity between generations, but also solidarity between living beings, because we don't only have a debt with one another when we protect ourselves against threats, we also have a debt with the living being from which we extract something in order to be a community. So maybe the previous solidarity forms, and we should include, when we speak about solidarity, all the living beings, and that's the challenge of the situation of animals that is supported by global health issues, and it forces us to review the previous forms of solidarity, not that because they were defensive, but the cartography of the previous forms of solidarity are obsolete, and we should design new forms. And Joy, Salman, I think it's quite strong to start from this concept of solidarity that has evolved through history, but also thinking of moments when we are more vulnerable due to a particular situation, in particularly when someone arrives at the hospital losing all his or her belongings, with the first colleagues, patients. Will that person search for solidarity, and will it create a collective group, a collective feeling within the hospital? So when I was there for a year, I could see two types of solidarity. First of all, the one between the patients, the social prisoners that are in the same situation, the bad situation. Okay, you've got some friendships, you've got some enemies, but there is a sense of common destiny that is to be closed up in a mental hospital, as if they were also sometimes in a castle. So it's a community grounded on resistance. And in my book, I was impressed by the fact that on a daily basis, the patients organize sabotage networks in order to not to respect the rules. They arrive there and they've got a list, a very long list of rules, where they can smoke, when they can smoke, what medicine they can take, if they are allowed to give a call, not to give a call, not to be allowed to keep their personal belongings with them. So there is this sense of solidarity for sabotaging in order also to inject some life in their daily routine. For instance, they hide things in the bedrooms. They exchange telephones in order to allow anyone who wants to give a call the possibility to do it. This is the type of solidarity I witnessed. And there's another type, which is a kind of class solidarity that was shown to me by one of the doctors. I could see that the cleaning ladies, and I speak about ladies because no man was doing that job, so the cleaning ladies were closer to the patients, more friendly, they could speak with them, more feelings also, they were more relaxed, they could even laugh with them. And when I wonder about this closeness, it was because they were from the same proletariat in a way, due to the social status of the patient. It was a public hospital, and psychiatry in a public hospital is clearly socially marked because all the patients come from very popular classes with terrible personal histories. No middle classes is there. So the doctor told me that between two forms of proletariat, they could identify each other. So there was a form of solidarity, of alliance. Because in a hospital, you've got a very strong hierarchy, and the doctors and the head doctor is a bourgeois figure, and then you've got nurses, doctors, nurses, etc. So these are the two types of solidarity I could witness. So Eric Kleinenberg, this type of relationship with solidarity that is organized around classes and the relationship with the otherness, are the elements you have witnessed in the USA? Could you let us know more about this element?
Well, yes. I mean, it's similar to what I described earlier in terms of exposure to things like climate threats or to a pandemic disease. It is very hard to sustain a sense that we're in it together, that you are my brother or sister, if you live in a society organized around extreme inequality, where it's clearly the case on a daily basis that people are living in different worlds, right? And so if you take, for instance, this process that we have of distributing vaccines in different places in the world, we can start to see some of the challenges of building something like solidarity. Because if people perceive, now I understand that the idea of vaccination is controversial, especially in France. So I'm very well aware that there's a lot of complicated views about whether to trust this particular medical technology. But I think if you live in a society where there's a perception that powerful people and powerful institutions will secure some prized public good for members of their group, whether the private good is a vaccine or access to better health care, or maybe it's access to remote work so that you're not exposed to other people during a pandemic, or maybe it's access to a place that's on higher ground so that you're not as exposed to floodwaters in a climate changed world. When you have situations like that, people who feel excluded, left out of the project don't feel like they have a genuine brotherhood, a genuine kind of solidarity. And the United States has such grotesque inequality at the moment that a number of people feel like it's just wrong to say we're in it together. And so I think, my interpretation of the Trump phenomenon in the United States, for instance, is that when Americans could vote 4 years ago on a candidate like Hillary Clinton, who came with a voice of reason and promised solidarity and equality, but came with a record of being associated with, a family and a political project that reminded them of neoliberalism and of kind of runaway market inequality, that didn't work for a number of people. And many Americans, millions of Americans said, I would rather blow up the whole society, right? They had a kind of political nihilism. We would rather destroy it and see what happens than have more of this. Because the danger with the language of solidarity is that, it appeals to people like us in a seminar room, but on the ground, it feels like empty rhetoric. It feels like a word that we use to cover what in reality are malign intentions. And so if we talk about solidarity, while what we're doing is hoarding resources and taking all the good jobs and taking the vaccine and taking the wealth, that's not fair or real. And I think one of the things that's kind of sophisticated people on the ground think, and that very crude people on the ground think, is that this language of solidarity is worn out, and our behavior does not match our ideals. And I think one of the major challenges for the 21st century is to reconstitute a genuine solidarity. And maybe the language can stay the same, but the praxis and the organizational reality has to be different.
Moi, ce qui m'intéresse vis-à-vis de ce que vous venez d'évoquer.
Well, what's appealing to me in what you've just said and related to the concept of solidarity is the notion of network and of networking and of, groups, working groups that can address the need for being together, for evolving together, and for moving forward together. This is a true question on the day-to-day basis, and I think that the pandemic we're going through really puts this into perspective from things that we had taken for granted in our society. And so maybe we can, all these, bonds that we had between friends and family, and all these things are being challenged right now. And what's interesting to me concerning these phenomena is when do we start prescribing things? Well, the notion of vulnerability sometimes leads us to prescribe things or to speak in a preventive way by warning people. So could you tell us a little bit more about this relationship to the animal world and this notion of being cruel towards animals by killing them in order to prevent the disease from spreading, for instance? Well, the notion of solidarity in pandemics that are animal-rooted is something that opposes human beings to animals. And so the fact that the vulnerability becomes a threat, well, this threat comes from nature, and this comes from the approach to medicine by Pasteur, who thought that it came from microbes. And if we take a closer look to the way a virus is transmitted, in bats, or porks or birds, we can see that we share this type of vulnerability. But the symptoms are different, and so we have killed 17 million animals in Denmark, but birds were confined, for instance, for a long time in order to protect them from influenza because of intensification of farming, of animal breeding. And what we can say here is that we can communicate, we can see them communicating through signals from a community to another, and it seems that it forms different worlds. And so we were saying that solidarity is a word in vain for an unequal society because people live in different worlds. But animals truly live in different worlds. So, for instance, we can see the signs of birds between them or in a bat colony. The way they interact between each other is so complex that we need to study ethnology to understand it. So can we have access to solidarity between birds? So maybe if we take a closer look at how other species perceive alerts and warning signals when they face predators, and how they manage these signals, maybe we could be inspired by animals. And vaccination, that is our solidarity driver right now, and the fact of sharing these jabs when facing the pandemic. This is also the sign of a transmission for cows when they have to face smallpox, for instance. So how can we manage to deal with something that's not human? This is something that we are facing more and more. And if we focus on the Anthropocene and if we focus on the matter itself, these elements can be important in our mythology systems. And for instance, volcanoes could, in a certain way, be responsible for a major eruption. So is it their choice to trigger that major threat or vulnerability factor? So everything could shift in terms of perspectives. So, what is interesting to me in your book, Joy, is what you managed to grasp in terms of understanding reality. Sometimes it's quite raw in the way you describe your characters, and these characters are able to understand what's really tough and raw around them, and they're grasping the complexity of what's around them. That's to say, floors, plants, what's around them, the rooms they're in, something that really overwhelms them. Well, what's really typical in insanity as this dual movement is the question of otherness. Insane people are the great others, so to speak. So there's this notion of very powerful otherness, but insanity is another kind of classification inside the human beings. And so, insane people are hypersensitive, and they can perceive very specific things in terms of otherness through the way psychotic people are totally open and porous to everything that comes from the outside world. And that's how doctors would describe it. They perceive any kind of stimulus in a hypersensitive way. So the light will totally make someone blind, the flight of a fly, or the noise of a fly around these people will drive them crazy. So their relationship to nature is totally accelerated in a way, and they have a very powerful relationship to nature, to animals. And they see animals as a mystery and as the embodiment of otherness. And so there's a kind of community and of pariah. And there's this desire to get back to nature, because they're all locked inside. Some of them would tell me that they were craving to go outside. And so the fact of going outside is something that is absolutely crucial crucial to them. And all of their senses are absolutely enhanced, and they're like superheroes in a way. So we are facing a kind of phenomenon where our own sensitivity stops us from seeing some other things. So I think we all depend on how we perceive the signals around us. And for instance, having the same abilities to see as a bat, or flying as a duck, or feeling water like a tree are things that from our perspective as human beings are difficult to grasp. So that's why I'm going to ask the one last question from the audience before closing and wrapping up. The notion of vulnerability. Can the notion of vulnerability be instrumentalized on the political side of things in order to classify and rank some different communities and populations? I think that the notion of vulnerability used in geography to tackle the question of risks in terms of land management and land use is then translated into maps that rank threats for vulnerable populations and communities. Well, let's say that this is an overarching look, and this anticipates for a lot of future events. But in terms of imagination and of imagining a disaster, such as a pandemic or a heat wave or an earthquake that affect the living, well then vulnerability is no longer distributed on a territory, but it becomes part of what we could call global health, or the global health status of a volcano. A volcano can pose the question of vulnerability because it can disrupt the routes of planes on Earth. From a bird's point of view, for instance. And so that's how we perceive vulnerability and not through a map.
I
think we're getting towards the end of our debate. So thank you so much to the three of you for bringing us some insights. Thank you very much, Eric Kleinenberg, Joy Sorman, and Frederick Keck. I wish you a very pleasant evening. I am Jérémy Cheval, and I strongly encourage you to follow the rest of our conferences until Sunday with a lot of different topics that are going to be covered. And despite the situation, we're all here together remotely or physically in order to discuss these topics. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening or afternoon. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.